Okay. Knowing Grace. This is the series that we've been in for the last 3 weeks. This is week 4, part 4. We've been looking at different passages in the Bible that speak explicitly and clearly about God's grace. There's a lot of confusion, both inside and outside religious circles, church circles, about what grace is. In fact, I find that there's actually more confusion and more misunderstanding inside the church when it comes to grace than there is outside the church. I grew up hearing about grace. I grew up learning about grace. But when I look back over my time in church and youth groups and Sunday school and that sort of thing, grace was not the dominant subject talked about. And when it was talked about, it was always explained more in terms of what it wasn't than what it was. I think most people inside the church think that if we talk about grace too much, people are going to get lackadaisical. They're going to get lazy. They're going to get spiritually lethargic. They're going to start behaving worse. But the Bible makes it clear that it's the exact opposite. When our hearts have been gripped and grasped by God's unconditional love, His one-way love for us, His grace, that lives begin to change. Our lives begin to change, especially in the face of our failures and our weaknesses. When we discover God's grace at the bottom, some of our hard edges get softened and we become more empathetic, more kind, more loving, more sacrificial, that sort of thing. So you can never, ever talk about grace too much. That is a massive misnomer. This idea that you can't talk about it too much because people will misunderstand it and take advantage of it. Listen, we're taking advantage of grace every single minute of the day, whether you realize it or not. The very air we breathe is a gift of grace from God. And so we can never talk about it too much. So this morning, I want to read from 2 Corinthians chapter 12. 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I'm going to begin in verse 7, and I'm going to read down through verse 10. 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. This is the Apostle Paul writing this. So to keep me from becoming proud, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger from Satan to torment me and keep me from becoming proud. 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So now, Paul says, I am glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. So over the last 3 weeks, we've seen that grace is not one part of the Christian faith. It is the essence of it, the essence of the Christian faith. Grace, in fact, defines Christianity. With God, it's never grace plus anything. It is grace alone, always grace alone. Now, in these verses, Paul talks specifically about the sufficiency of grace, where God says to him after he asks for this problem in his life to be removed 3 times, God says, "My grace is all you need. My grace is sufficient for you." How when it's all said and done, grace from God is all we absolutely need. It's not relief that we ultimately need, it's grace. It's not answers that we ultimately need, it's grace. It's not a problem-free life that we ultimately need, it's grace. What we need most is the presence of grace, not the absence of suffering or the absence of hard things. Now, most of the attention on these verses over the years has been given to Paul's thorn. I've talked about this here a few times. A lot of ink has been spilled speculating as to what this thorn in the flesh was. And the Bible doesn't tell us what it was. I mean, I think people have wondered over the years whether it was eyesight. Maybe he struggled physically in some way. If you remember when God rescued him, confronted him on the road to Damascus, he was made blind for a few days. And some people suggest that maybe his eyesight never fully came back, so they say that was his thorn in the flesh. Other people speculate that his thorn in the flesh was a difficult person. Other people speculate that it was something like lust or pride or a struggle of that nature. But the Bible doesn't say, and I'm pretty sure that the reason God doesn't tell us is so that it relates to all of us. It could be anything. If it was specific as to what this thorn in the flesh was, we might excuse ourselves. Like, well, that's not my problem, so this doesn't relate to me. This doesn't apply to me. I think God keeps it generic and general on purpose so that it relates to all of us. It could be anything. It could be everything. Whatever makes your life heavy and hard, whatever causes you anxiety, what prompts your tears, the hurts that you carry, the fears that you have, your silent struggles, your secrets, your heartaches, those are all your thorns. Those are all my thorns. Life is hard. Pain is real. Thorns hurt. We know that. And yet, these verses make clear that the heart of God shines in and through the hardest of things. If it were up to Paul, and quite frankly, if it were up to us, we'd choose comfort and ease over pain and hard things every minute of the day. Nobody would rather have pain than ease. Nobody would rather have discomfort than comfort. If it were up to Paul, if it were up to me, if it were up to us, we'd choose comfort and ease over pain and hard things every minute of the day. And we'd be worse because of it. The things that matter most, things like wisdom, humility, depth, love, self-awareness, compassion, empathy, those things are acquired and developed in hard places. Think about all the stuff that attracts us to other people. Things like humility, care, understanding, insight, depth of feeling, patience with others. We love that stuff. We admire people who possess those qualities. We long to possess those qualities. We want to be around people like that. And when we're like that, people want to be around us. Fyodor Dostoevsky once said that pain and suffering are always inevitable for a large intelligence and a deep heart. Those things cannot be developed apart from hard things, apart from difficult circumstances, apart from thorns in the flesh. I have never met a deep, wise, empathetic, gracious, self-aware person who hasn't suffered greatly and failed miserably. Never. And I doubt you have either. The people that we know who possess those qualities are typically marked by some deep hurt, some sense of failure, an awareness of their own weaknesses. Humility doesn't come any other way. Things like compassion and empathy don't come another way. I've told you this before, but years ago, when Stacy and I first met, she said, I've listened to a lot of your sermons and I read, some of your books. And she said, your ministry, I won't get this exactly right, but she said, your ministry was always very sympathetic to the sinner and the sufferer. The things that I preach here, I've preached for decades. But she said, there's something different now. God bless you. There's something different now. There's an empathy that marks your ministry. And I think the difference between sympathy and empathy is this. Sympathy is when you're listening to somebody and you're going, man, I hear what you're saying. Empathy is when you're listening to someone who's hurting and you say, man, I feel what you're feeling because I've been there. There's no way that we would be able to help people who are in the dark if we weren't well acquainted with the dark ourselves. Wounded healers, Henry Nouwen called us. People who know their weaknesses have a much deeper awareness of God's grace. Much deeper awareness. So whoever told us that God's primary purpose in our lives is to make us strong lied to us. God's goal, make no mistake about it, is to progress us, to move us forward, but it's not an upward progression from weakness to strength. It's a downward progression from strength to weakness. Spiritual growth, in other words, is not about climbing higher, getting better, and becoming more self-sufficient. Spiritual growth is about discovering more and bigger caverns of need into which more and more of God's grace can flow into our lives. Real growth, in other words, is marked by a growing realization of just how much grace we need. That's really what it is. This is why Jesus, throughout the gospel, always holds up children as examples. Always. They have nothing to boast about. They have no moral resumes to brag about. There's no jaw-dropping feats of spiritual prowess. All they have are empty hands waiting to be filled, empty mouths waiting to be fed. They are trophies, paragons of reception. That's what they are. All they can do is receive. This is why I've said that I've learned more about God and His grace sitting in a circle with desperate people at rock bottom than I have in almost any church service I've ever been in, ever. Sitting with people who know they're weak is so much more life-giving than sitting with people who think they're strong. If you've been there, you know that. I said something like that on social media yesterday, and someone said, very respectfully, mind you, that we don't have to hit bottom to discover God's grace. We just have to walk faithfully with God. Now, I could have said a bunch of things to that, okay? Or I could have said nothing to that. But I simply responded and said, in my experience, there are things we learn about God and ourselves only when we are at the end of our rope. I think that's true. I believe that's true with all my heart. You see, the truth is, we don't have to dive into some pit to discover grace. We're already in it. Some of us know it, and others don't. Romans chapter 5, verse 20 is one of the clearest verses in the Bible. In that verse, Paul says this: God's law was given so that all people could see how sinful they were. But as people sinned more and more, God's wonderful grace became even more abundant. I mean, that is the law and the gospel in a nutshell, in like 18 or 20 words. The purpose of God's law, he's saying, is to show us that we're already in the pit. We don't have to dive into the pit. We don't have to seek out the pit. We don't have to screw up on purpose. I've told you this story before, but years ago, I was speaking at a college conference, a conference full of college students. And toward the end, I said, because Jesus succeeded for you, you're free to fail. And when it was over, one of the, I guess, chaperones made a beeline for me at the front of the room. And he said, you just encouraged, he didn't like that phrase. And he said, you just encouraged over 2,500 college students to fail. And I said, time out. First of all, they were failing just fine before I said a word. That's the first thing. The second thing is I didn't encourage them to fail. I'm encouraging them to admit that they are failing so that they look to God and His grace and what Jesus has done for them. So the purpose of God's law is to show us that we're already in the pit, that we're desperate and needy and weak when it comes to God. Only then will we see that, when we know that, when we feel that, only then will we see grace. So, for instance, I don't need to have an affair and get caught to discover God's grace. But I do need to know that I have an adulterous heart. God's law tells me that. I don't need to embezzle money and get caught to discover God's grace, but I do need to know that my heart is greedy, and God's law tells me that. We don't need to become an alcoholic or a drug addict to discover God's grace, but we do need to know that we all have unhealthy relationships with something or someone we depend on to soothe the pain, to make us feel strong, secure, safe, important, loved, in control. We're all attached to something we think we need to be happy and content. We're all drunk on something. So we don't have to hit rock bottom. God's law informs us that we're at rock bottom already. Let's pray. Just kidding. There's good news coming, okay? I think that this is, I'm going to go back because I think that this is really, really, really important. Whenever I tell my story, and I'm wide open about it, wherever I go, whether I'm writing something or speaking something, I'm wide open about it. And there are times when people push back and they say to me something like, do we have to go through what you went through in order to discover grace the way you talk about it? In fact, I was being interviewed by a pastor at a church in Texas a few years ago. And after sharing my story, he said to me on stage, he came up after I finished speaking to interview me and ask me some questions. And he said, okay, your grasp of God's grace, or more accurately, God's grace's grasp of you, is evident. So tell us, how do we get there? How do we arrive there without failing miserably? And I said, I don't think you or your people are going to like my answer, but I don't think you can. And I'm not saying by that you have to go out intentionally and fail miserably. I'm saying if you take God's law seriously, if you take God's demands seriously, what you'll discover is that you're already at bottom, already there. The big problem inside Christian circles, in my opinion, is not that we don't take God's grace seriously enough. That's a huge problem. It's that we don't take God's law seriously enough so that we see our dire need for grace. That's really the issue. And so, like I said, I nor you need to have an affair to get caught to discover God's grace, but you do need to know that you have an adulterous heart. That given the right set of circumstances, you would fall because your heart is deceitful above all things, Jeremiah tells us. You don't need to embezzle money and get caught to discover God's grace, but you do need to know that your heart is greedy, and God's law tells us that. So we don't have to hit rock bottom. We are at rock bottom. Some of us are aware of that, and others aren't. But, thank God, the good news is that the office of God's grace is at the end of our rope. That's what Paul is saying here. It's been said that grace is like water. It always flows downward and gathers at the bottom of things. And what that means is that God meets us in the low places. He meets us in the back alleys of our secrets. He meets us in the ruins of our regrets. He meets us in the cracks of our fears. He comes to us in the wreckage of our consequences, in the debris of our repeated failures. We find God in our losses, not outside of them. So thorns hurt. We don't like them. Paul didn't like them. I don't like them. You don't like them. But they are our friends. They're not our enemies. They are our friends because they lead us to grace, which leads us ultimately to freedom. Many people assume that God's grace is missing in action where discernible behavioral improvement is lacking. So if someone's not improving behaviorally at the pace that you think they ought to be, then God's grace is missing in action. But maybe, just maybe, my willingness to admit my lack of improvement in some ways is a sign of improvement. Like I said earlier, maybe God's grace at work in my life is my growing realization of how much grace I need, or how much grace I already have. Maybe God's grace in our lives is evidenced primarily not by getting better, whatever that even means, but by telling the truth about ourselves, by admitting our weaknesses, by acknowledging our secrets, telling our stories, acknowledging our struggles. Maybe we've been looking for God in all the wrong places. We've been told that if we want to find God, we have to look up, but maybe we need to look low. Maybe God hangs out in the slums of our weaknesses and our fears and our failures and our losses and our insecurities and our frustrations rather than in the bustling cities of our strengths and accomplishments. Frederick Buechner, one of my favorite writers, once said, "It is in the dark where he seems to visit most often." I know that to be true. God's promises that I always believed from the time I was a little boy. I didn't doubt that God told the truth. I didn't doubt that God existed. I walked away from him for years as a teenager, but I never doubted that God was real. I never doubted that God was telling the truth when he made promises. So I believed those things, but those promises were proven true when I was at rock bottom. When I gave God every opportunity and every reason to walk away from me, as other people did, and he stuck by me and proved his friendship to me, that he is indeed a friend that sticks closer than a brother. Someone asked me, "What have you learned most about God since your crash and burn nearly 10 years ago?" And my immediate answer was his friendship. I understand something about friendship now in a way that I didn't before. I understand that I didn't have as many friends as I thought I had. I understand that I wasn't as good of a friend as I thought I was. And I now understand how amazing of a friend God is. A true friend. So when I was at bottom, I went to college, I went to seminary, I read a lot of books, I studied a lot. There were a lot of things about God that I knew with my head. But it wasn't until I hit rock bottom that I started to learn things, see things, feel things about God in my heart that I always believed in my head were true, but now I was experiencing them on a whole new level because I was at my worst. Not my best. C.S. Lewis put it this way: "It is when we notice the dirt that God is most present in us." Beautiful, true to life. So, what if real progress is a growing awareness of our need for help? We're obsessed with getting fixed, fixing ourselves, fixing other people, fixing this world. But what if getting fixed has more to do with accepting our limitations? Finally, taking off the masks we wear and being honest about our unfixedness. What if God's mission in our lives is not to get us out of hard places, but for us to discover him in hard places? What if life is less about God picking us up when we fall as much as it is about God loving us on the ground? That's what Paul is clearly saying in these verses. 3 different times I begged God to take it away, this thorn. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So now, Paul says, I am glad to boast about my weaknesses, tell the truth about myself, take off my masks, be real. I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses, to be bold about my limitations, my unfixedness, so that the power of Christ will be shown through me. And then he goes on to say, crazily, that's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses, in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer. For when I am weak, then I am strong. In those verses, weakness and strength are completely redefined. We tend to have our own definitions for what is weak, what is strong. In these verses, God gives us his definition of weakness and strength, redefines the terms. So, the way of true spiritual strength is the humble, self-distrustful way of consciously recognizing our weaknesses. And like Paul, not trying to hide them or Photoshop them or suppress them or put them away, but to talk about them. I don't know, and people have asked me this, like, why do you always have to reference your own life, your own story? There are people who actually say those kinds of things, strangers. I mean, who says that to people? Anyway, so, but they're like, why do you always have to do that? And my simple answer is, I know of no better way to show you the best parts of God without showing you some of the worst parts of me. I have no idea, and that's what Paul's saying here. I boast in my weaknesses. I'm not proud of my failures. I'm not proud of these things that I've done wrong. I'm not proud of my screw-ups, but I talk about them openly because it's when I do that you see God's grace in a way that you've never seen it before. That you see God's provision in a way that you may have never seen it before. That you see God's friendship in a way that you so desperately need to see. So I'm following Paul's example here when I talk about my own weaknesses, when I talk about my own struggles, because there is no other way for you or I to see God's amazing grace unless we're open about that stuff with one another. There are things about God I would not know if you did not share your struggles with me. There are things about God I would not know if you did not share your hardships with me. There's no way. When I see, one of the beautiful things about the vault is we sit in this circle and we go around the room, and anybody who wants to talk can talk. And one of the things that we do is we identify a struggle, a particular struggle that we're having. It could be financial, it could be marital, it could be something revolving around an addiction of some sort. But we talk about our struggles. And I'm telling you, one of the reasons I absolutely love being at the vault, going to the vault, is not just because it gives me an opportunity to sort of unburden myself with my friends and my brothers, but I get to hear how God is working through the struggles of the people in the room. I see God in a way that I could not if I was just reading a book or studying. When I'm actually with people made in God's image, broken people, living in this broken world with other broken people, talking about their brokenness, I see God. This is exactly what Paul is saying in these verses. It's unmistakable. It's unarguable what he's saying here. So, the bad news is that our thorns aren't going away just yet. But the good news is, either is God. God is interested in you. The you who has thorns. The you who is a thorn to someone else. The you who hides. The you who has bad days. The you who wants to quit. The you who feels hopeless in certain circumstances. The you who suffers in silence. Not the photoshopped you, not the clean and pretty you, the real you. He's interested in you, and he meets you where you are, on the ground, at the bottom, where all of us actually are. Some of us have the eyes and the self-awareness to see that, and others spend their entire lives trying to escape it, deny it, suppress it. But the truth of the matter is, His grace is sufficient. It's all we need. When it comes down to it, when it's all said and done, His grace is all we need. My friend Steve Brown, who's preached here a handful of times, who's in his 80s now, said a few years ago that if God's grace isn't everything, I'm screwed. It's true. Wisdom from an old man, someone who knows if God's grace isn't everything, not one thing, not one of many things, if it's not everything, we're screwed.